First, I have to begin by saying that the limud tonight is Li'ilu Nishmat Avi Mori, Dov Ber Meir Ben Reuven Halevi, Imi Marati Rachel Bat Harav Michael, and also the Ilui Nishmat uh, Aliza Bat Avraham, my Rhonda's sister-in-law, who was tragically killed in a car accident last week, Thursday in the afternoon. And her aliyah her neshama should also have an aliyah. Okay. Um, everybody is here, can hear, I hope. Welcome to all. And I'm going to again do a screen share for those of you who don't have a Chumash. If I can pull the right screen up here. Let's.
New background.
Oh, I'm sorry. You like the new background? Yeah, we'll talk about the new background a little bit later. Let's see if we can get my screen up here so that you can see the proper thing here. Everybody should be able to see my screen with the few psukim that I've got posted for tonight's shir. So um, the topic of tonight's shir is probably more is really last week's shir, but since we didn't meet last week, I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of exile, and and I'm hoping that I will have enough time to get into what I think are how we, the Jewish people, have to find our way out of exile. So that's the brief discussion, and I think it all starts. I'm going to go all the way back to Parshat Vayigash a couple of weeks ago, which is this is the first pasuk that I've got on the screen here is the last pasuk of Parshat Vayigash, where it says that Bnei Yisrael Vayeshev Yisrael Be'eretz Mitzrayim Be'eretz Goshen. The Bnei Yisrael lived in Mitzrayim in Goshen, and then it was a very interesting word. It says Vayeachazu Ba. And then Vayifru Vayirbu Ma'od. This Vayifru Vayirbu Ma'od is very, very much reminiscent of what we're going to have later on. Um, but the interesting word in this pasuk, as to me, is Vayeachazuba. The word Vayeachazuba literally means they grabbed on and held on to it. Le'achoz means to hold on to something, to take hold of it. Now it's interesting, and Rav Hirsch comment, this is from Samson Fall Hirsch back in Parshat Chaye Sarah, where Avram talks about buying an achuzat kever. The concept of achuzah, which in theory should apply to anything that is movable, in the Torah generally applies to karka, to real estate, as opposed to movables. So when it says vayeachazu ba, they took possession of it, it's referring to the land, which seems a very, very, I don't know if this is intended to be a criticism of Bnei Yisrael, but certainly if we look at what follows, it clearly appears to be a criticism of Am Yisrael, that they took possession in a way that they were held fast to it. As such, one of the reasons that real estate, and Rav Hirsch, as I said, this is basically from Rav Hirsch on Parashat Chaye Sarah, says that real estate is called achuzah because you can't take it with you. Hafuch, it holds you fast, not you hold it fast, but it grabs you and holds you and keeps you in a specific spot. One of the greatest challenges, I think, of Jewish people living abroad, living outside of Eretz Yisrael, is that when we purchase a piece of property in a place outside of Eretz Yisrael, we feel bound to that place. This is a problem because we have to understand that Eretz Yisrael is our only home. And I think the Torah here is alluding to the fact that that this is out of place here for Am Yisrael to become attached to any place of property that is not Eretz Yisrael. So this is a problem that the Torah, I think, is sort of alluding to by this one word. Interestingly enough, if we go further and we look at um, the events that happen after Yaakov dies, it's very illustrative that after Yaakov has died and now has, we already
Aaron,
see, I'm sorry,
Aaron,
Yaakov, what did I
Eileen
say?
asks if there's Eileen asks if there's a connection between the word ahuz and percentages.
Um, Achuz as a percentage, I don't think so. I think lechos I mean, maybe it's an interesting concept. Perhaps an achuz is a percentage that is taken. So, I mean, that's where the word comes from. But I don't think it relates specifically. Achuz there generally does not relate to real estate, but it certainly relates to grab that you have a portion in it, that you have a share of it. So that's
Right,
hence
but
would
also
be.
their portion in terms of their percentage of the representation in the land, right, or also grew.
Um,
Maybe
I,
that's where.
Oh, I know. I again, I think this Vayel Chazubah doesn't mean it. It's not intended that they took a percentage of it. Hafuch. It's intended that they took full possession of Eretz Goshen. Okay, and Vayel Chazubah, they possessed it. They owned it. I mean, that's. I don't think anybody, at least that I've seen, translates or this relating to a percentage of Eretz Goshen. Um, they because they again Yosef, they are in charge. They have the full ownership of Eretz Goshen. Okay. Okay. Moving on. Again, the next. I mean, so the first stage is Bnei Yisrael begin to feel comfortable at home in Eretz Yisrael. This is before. This is when Yaakov is still alive, and yet we see that upon Yaakov's death, Yosef already has a different relationship with Paro. When Yosef, when Yosef is interpreting his dream, we know that Yosef is giving advice to Paro. He's controlling after Paro makes him second in command. He is basically in full control of the entire what's the word I'm trying to think, the entire prosperity, the entire economy of Egypt is in his control. And yet suddenly when Yaakov dies and he wants to go to bury him, he can't even approach Paro. It says Vayidaber Yosef el beit Paro lemor. He says, Dabru na biaznei Paro lemor. Please intercede on my behalf with Paro and ask him for permission to bury my father. Yosef doesn't even feel comfortable enough going to Paro directly. So we see already that there's a difference in the relationship between Yosef and Paro already as developing while Yosef is still alive. We already see that perhaps this relationship where Yosef is welcome, he's the fair-haired child and he can do anything he wants, suddenly it seems to be diminished a little bit. And Paro's answer to Yosef is Aleu kport avicha kasher ishbiecha, only because you swore that you to your father will I let you go. It appears that he was not really willing to let him go. So we see already that the perception of the ruling power toward the Jews is already not as smooth as it once was. We then get to the book of Shemot, where the first thing we read about is Vayamat Yosef v'chol echav v'chol ador hahu. Yosef died, the brothers all died. This generation has finished. It's gone. It's left. And suddenly we read about Bnei Yisrael, Paru, Vayishritzu, Vayirbu, Vayatzmu, V'mod Mod, Vatimole haaretz otam. Suddenly the land is filled with the Jews, and there's going to be some problems coming down the road. So the question we have to first look at and try to understand is what is driving this negative feeling about the Jews? Is it something the Jews are doing? Or is it something that's driven entirely by outside forces? And I think one of the things that we have to understand, the fact that all of this is recorded clearly in the Torah, that it's a combination. There's no one single factor that causes this change. It is a culmination of factors. First and foremost, it is the fact that if we go back to Parshat Vayigash and Vayechi, Yosef is providing for his whole family. They're all on the government payroll. Everybody else is selling their sheep, their cattle, their land, everything they own in order to provide food for themselves during the famine. And yet here Joseph and his brothers are living off the land. They're living off the taxpayers. So already we've set up a situation where there is potential for negative feelings. Okay, these are the people who there are the haves and there are the have-nots. And so when Bnei Yisrael now start to fill up the land, and they're still theoretically being supported by the government, suddenly, wait a minute, there's going to be a backlash. We can expect that. Another factor that we have to take into account is always the fact that I think whenever Jews are outside of Eretz Yisrael, and we forget that Eretz Yisrael is our home, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to send us a reminder. That reminder is often sent through the powers that be, changing their attitude toward Am Yisrael. If we look throughout Jewish history in the diaspora, we will find that Jewish communities that once flourished, whether it was in Babylonia, whether it was in North Africa, whether it was in Spain, Germany, Russia, Poland, every country where Jews have been successful and felt so successful that they've laid down roots and felt that they were at home and started talking about their host country as being their mother country, we know that that Puraniot is not far away. Again, study each one of those countries I just listed, and you'll find that right in the wake of Jewish success and Jewish success that causes Jews to feel their home comes a backlash of anti Semitism. Same thing happens in our parsha of Shemot. Vayakam melech chodesh al Mitzrayim. Again, key factor here is asher lo yadat Yosef. He doesn't recognize Yosef. Not that he didn't study history, but he did not want to recognize that it was Yosef, that it was the Jew who had saved the country. The Jews didn't do anything for us. It's what have you done for us lately? Nothing. Fine, we don't need you anymore. Now, again, there's a whole discussion among the commentaries and among the historians as to this Melech Chadash. The Gemara brings down a machloket between Rav and Shmuel, whether there really was a new king or this was the same king and he just revised, changed his policy. And it was Melech Chadash doesn't necessarily mean that he was a brand new king. It means that his policies changed. And that opinion draws its support from the fact that normally, if a new king arises, it means that the old king died. And since there's no mention of an old king dying and then a new king taking the throne, the fact this is Vayakam Melech Chadash, a new king arose, without mentioning what happened to the old king, leads one of them, Rav and Shmuel, again, the machloket between the two of them, to say that this was not a physically new king. It was simply a king whose position toward the Jewish people changed. And his position changes because he is willing to exorcise from his memory the good things that the Jewish people have done for Egypt. And he is able to focus on the negative, and he is able to get his people to focus on the negative to create a new order toward the Jews. And this, as I said, if we go through the Pesukim, we find that it starts out again very almost innocently. Let's figure out a way to deal with this problem. We have a Jewish problem on our hand. The Jewish people are multiplying faster than we are. Ultimately, they're going to be more than we are, and they're going to take over. They're going to kick us out of our own land. That's what the primary worry of Paro is, and he is able to create that same feeling within the people so that they are willing to accept his new policies of anti Semitism. And this becomes critical. If, again, anytime we go through persecution of the Jews, we find that it starts at the top and works its way down. Once the people feel they've got the support of the government, they have no qualms in disowning the Jews, in taking, plundering the Jews, because the Jews happen to be the ones who have all the money. So this pattern that begins with the Egyptian galut repeats itself over and over again. And as I said, there are, a number of different factors that cause it, but I think the primary factor, if we really want to think about it, is the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is reminding us that we cannot ever become too comfortable anywhere, with the exception of Eretz Yisrael. That when we are outside of Eretz Yisrael, whatever we are doing is temporary. It needs to be a stopover to get us back to Eretz Yisrael. When we forget that, we forget who we are as a people, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu has to send a reminder. So so again, I think we're fairly well familiar with the different stages that the enslavement takes, that the persecution takes, until ultimately, at the end, Paro basically declares the Jews to be persona non-existent, and it's okay to kill all the Jewish children, as we found many times throughout history, where again it might start out with economic um, sanctions, it might start out with heavy taxes, but ultimately it leads to Jewish blood becoming non what's the word I'm trying to think? You can't non enforceable. Killing Jews is no longer a crime ultimately. And whether that killing is organized by the government or is simply sanctioned by the government really doesn't make much of a difference. So the question now we have to ask is, what is the Torah trying to teach us in terms of, once we've reached that stage, how do we get out of it? So we're going to go to Perek Bet of last week's parsha, and Perek Bet in the first 10 psukim tells us about Moshe Rabbeinu and his very early years. And yet, even though Moshe Rabbeinu is going to become the focal point of the story, before we get to Moshe Rabbeinu, we have a number of other players in this story who, interestingly enough, all happen to be females. It's very interesting that the Torah, the Midrash tells us that it's the women who bring about the redemption, and it's clearly seen here in this story. Okay, the story begins with an anonymous man who takes an anonymous woman, Vayelech ish bebeit Levi vayikach bat Levi. But after that first word and the second word of Vayelech ish, everybody else in this story is a female. Vataru Isha, she gives birth to a son. Now, very interestingly, the Torah says, Vatere oto kitovhu. My first question is, how many of you know a mother who doesn't think her son is tov? I don't know a whole lot. I don't know any, as a matter of fact. I think every woman thinks their son is tov, at least when they start out. It's only when they get to the terrible twos that changes. But this seems to this word tov basically is the Torah screaming out that there's got to be something here. Now, when we think of Tov and we go back to, we're the first parsha of a new book, we go back to the first chapter of Bereshit, and we have this constant phrase, Vayar Elokim ki Tov, Vayar Elokim ki Tov. This phrase, Vatere oto ki Tov, seems very, very reminiscent of creation. And the question we have to try to understand is, what, by using this term, Vatere oto ki tovu, what is the Torah trying to tell us about creation? And I think again, in the context that we're developing tonight, I think it's that every person has the ability to emulate God's creative activity. And one of the ways we do that clearly is through childbirth, but more so, it's through acknowledging that the child is a gift of God and educating that child to acknowledge and recognize God. So I think Vatere Oto Kitovhu seems to be a focusing us on the fact that this mother was clearly aware of the miraculous nature of this birth, of the miraculous nature of this child, and yet she's able to hide him for 3 months. Again, the Midrash very simply says the reason she's able to hide him for 3 months is because he was born 3 months premature. Perhaps that might explain why his mother, when he survives, is much more clearly aware of the miraculous nature of his survival. So that would make sense with the Kitovhu, the fact that she was able to hide him for 3 months before they came looking at the quote end of her pregnancy for her. However, the fact that she's able to hide him for 3 months leads us to question, if she knew that she was only going to be able to hide him for 3 months, why didn't she make an attempt during that 3 months to get him out of the country or to do something with him? Why does she wait until that period is over, and then she first goes and throws him in a basket? Why does she wait that 3-month period? So it appears that perhaps she is spending that time, in addition to trying to make sure that the baby survives, because again, if he's premature, perhaps he was sickly as a child. We don't know that, but
Maybe
perhaps
that's what the ketov is.
I'm
The
sorry.
ketov is that here you have a baby born after 6 months. You wouldn't think that baby would be ketov. You think the baby would not be able to survive. So she sees this child who's born prematurely and says, he's viable.
No, I think, as I said, I think the Kitov is how I think that's part of it. The fact that he survives, I think, is a critical part of this Kitov, because that helps her understand that this is a miracle child. This child was not supposed to survive. And I think that's a key component, similarly to the birth of Yitzchak, where the miraculous nature of the birth is a critical component of the store of this child's existence and this child's being, as who they're going to become. So I think that is part of it. But again, as I said, I think there's more to it than that. Okay. So again, in theory, she is spending this 3 months formulating this plan. So, because interestingly enough, again, this whole verse 3, which says she wasn't able to hide him, she takes a basket, she puts pitch and tar and fixes this basket up and puts the child in it and puts it by the sea, seems to be a predetermined course of action. She had already decided she was going to do this when the child was born, if he survived through this 3-month period. Again, she decides that she is not going to wait passively for the Egyptian police to come and see where this child is so they can kill it. And therefore, her again, you'll notice the proliferation of verbs. Vatikach, vatachmar, vatasem. She is being very active, proactively trying to provide for her child. Similarly, his sister, the second female we have introduced in this story, Vatetav achoto merachok. His sister is standing off in the distance. So again, she is being active, even though it seems that she's passively waiting to know what's going to happen. Nonetheless, she is actively going and waiting and watching. And ultimately, she will become active later on when she goes and gets involved later on in the story. But again, we have these two women, the mother and the daughter, saying that the way to bring about redemption, what we need to do to get to redemption, is to be active. to actively seek out ways that we can save ourselves. It's not to sit and wait for God. Yes, God will provide the help, but we need to be proactive. And I think that is a critical component of this opening story, that the mother, the sister, again, as I said, throughout this whole story, everybody is anonymous. The only one who's not anonymous is Paro's daughter. Everybody else is an anonymous person in this chapter. And they are being active because that is the way we bring about salvation. That when we find ourselves, the Jewish people, in the throes of Galut, we have to be active, seeking out situations, seeking out opportunities to lead, to bring about redemption. Here they're taught, again, these two women don't know, although according to the Midrash, they may have had an inkling that this child was going to grow up to be somebody special, but they are simply trying on a very small, perhaps personal level, to bring about salvation. Because if they do nothing, the police are going to come, this child is going to be thrown in the river or killed some other way. So they are trying in their own way to redeem this child. Hence, they are beginning the process of redemption. Um, the third player in this story is the one who we perhaps don't expect to be part of this story, and that's Bat Paro. But again, you'll notice that Bat Paro also is active. Vatered, vatere, vatishlach. She is again actively participating in this story. She is not a passive player in this story. She is doing something. So the question we have to ask is, did the child, the mother, I've tried to remain anonymous here, did this mother and daughter have reason to believe that this person who finds the basket was going to be the one that finds the basket? In other words, was the basket put specifically where this person and this person alone would find it? Or is this a random happening that they just happened to pick that place? And so I don't have an answer to that question. But I've seen a couple of suggestions, and I've heard one orally that says that this whole, what we think of as a spontaneous decision to put this baby in a basket and spontaneously put him somewhere, was not so spontaneous. That this was a plan that had been developed based on an awareness that this person who was going to find the basket was somebody who might very well be properly disposed toward this child to want to save it, as well as properly positioned to save the child, where nobody could question that this child, that they were, that they, I guess, above the law, or that the law wouldn't come and look for this child. So again, there are different theories that I've seen advanced over the last couple of years that suggest that perhaps these two women knew that this third woman was going to be there and would be kindly disposed toward this child. Whether it was because they had heard about it, they had interacted with this person before, don't know. One person suggested me, this actually was my daughter-in-law, suggested that perhaps either the mother or the daughter happened to have been chosen as the private servant of this specific Bat Paro, and therefore knew enough about her to know that if the baby was put in her way, that she would be kindly disposed to it. And they knew her daily routine, where she would go, and therefore they put the basket there. It's an interesting theory, that this was all planned. I saw actually very recently somebody who suggested that perhaps Bat Paro Paro's daughter had perhaps interacted with the midwives when they were disobeying Paro, and they knew that she might be, again, favorably disposed toward ending the genocide of the Jewish children. So perhaps some of that may come together. But again, in any case, I think the point of the story, and then the point that I wanted to get from the story, is the fact that there are lots of verbs that are very active from these three women who are going to, on an individual basis, they're going to save this one child, but that one child is going to grow up to be the child who brings about redemption. And I think that the Torah is trying to tell us very, very clearly, A, how the Jews end up in exile when we forget Hashem and we forget Eretz Yisrael, and how we get out of it by being active, by actively pursuing redemption and actively trying to bring ourselves back. And I think that's those were the points I really wanted to make tonight. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for comments, feedback, and questions. Anybody? Don't all yell at once. Okay. All right. So thank you all for